The diner was dead quiet, save for the hum of the neon sign and the breathing of a 7-year-old girl asleep in the corner booth. For the exhausted worker behind the counter, it was just another dead-end graveyard shift until the bell above the door chimed. A woman walked in wearing a coat worth more than a used car, trailed by a man whose shadow loomed like a coffin. She asked for a black coffee. The terror didn't register until she handed back the laminated menu. Her fingers were twitching, not with a tremor, but in deliberate sign language. In a matter of seconds, she spelled out 6 words that shattered the quiet night. "Help me. He has a gun." The neon sign outside Hank's diner had a bad ballast. It buzzed with a low, angry hum, flashing the letters NER into the damp autumn night like a distress beacon. Inside, it smelled of burnt filter coffee, old fryer grease, and the sharp, chemical tang of industrial floor cleaner. Matthew leaned against the stainless steel counter, a gray rag hanging limply from his calloused hand. He was 34, but the harsh fluorescent lighting added 10 years to the heavy bags under his eyes. He didn't mind the graveyard shift. It paid an extra $2 an hour, and in the quiet, dead hours between 2 and 5 a.m., the world left him alone. More importantly, it allowed him to keep an eye on his life's only anchor. In the back booth, safely tucked away from the windows, sat Lily. She was 7. A mess of curly brown hair obscured her face as she hunched over a coloring book, violently applying a bright purple crayon to an oversized picture of a dog. She didn't hear the buzzing neon sign. She didn't hear the drunk college student snoring in the booth by the restrooms. Lily had been born entirely deaf. Matthew watched her for a moment, the chronic knot of anxiety in his chest loosening just a fraction. He tapped his knuckles against the metal counter. Lily didn't hear it, but she felt the vibration through the floorboards. She popped her head up, her brown eyes locking onto him. Matthew raised his hands, his movements fluid and practiced. "Tired?" he signed, tapping his bent fingers against his chest and letting them fall. Lily scrunched her nose, shaking her head vigorously. She signed back, her small hands moving with rapid-fire defiance. "Not tired? Hungry? Want fries?" Matthew offered a faint, crooked smile. "No fries?" "Apple." She gave him a look of profound, theatrical betrayal and aggressively went back to coloring her purple dog. Matthew turned back to the coffee machine, rinsing out the carafe. Life was a ledger of brutal mathematics. Rent was due in 4 days. The batteries for her external processors, which he couldn't afford to replace when they broke last month, were bleeding him dry. His ex-wife had done the math 3 years ago, realized the equation ended in perpetual debt, and walked out the door. Matthew didn't have the luxury of walking out. He had the diner, he had the coffee, he had Lily. At 2:14 a.m., the bell above the glass door chimed. A rush of cold, damp air swept into the stale diner. Matthew didn't look up immediately. He tossed the rag into the sink and grabbed 2 plastic menus. When he finally turned, his cynical customer service smile died on his lips. People who came into Hank's at 2:14 a.m. were usually truck drivers strung out on caffeine, third-shift warehouse workers, or drunks looking to absorb cheap tequila with a plate of hash browns. The 2 people standing in the foyer did not belong here. The woman was in her mid-30s. She wore a tailored charcoal wool coat over a silk blouse. Even under the brutal, flickering diner lights, her skin had the expensive, flawless finish of someone who consumed designer water and lived in penthouses. But it wasn't her wealth that caught Matthew's eye. It was her posture. She was rigid, brittle, like a pane of glass vibrating seconds before it shatters. Her eyes were wide, darting toward the exits, the kitchen, and finally, to Matthew. Standing right behind her, entirely too close, was a man. He was tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a dark, nondescript suit that fit too well off the rack. His face was a slab of granite, entirely devoid of expression. His right hand was buried deep in his coat pocket. His left hand rested flat against the small of the woman's back. It wasn't a gesture of affection. It was a leash. He was guiding her, physically forcing her forward by subtle fractions of an inch. "Booth," the man said. His voice was flat, gravelly. He didn't look at Matthew. He looked around the diner, sweeping the room. He catalogued the sleeping drunk. He catalogued the kitchen doors. He glanced at the back booth where Lily was coloring, dismissing her as a non-threat in half a second. "Anywhere you like," Matthew said, his voice neutral. The man steered the woman to a booth in the center of the room. It gave him a clear sightline of the front door, the kitchen, and the bathrooms. He slid into the side facing the door. He made her sit on the inside, trapped against the wall. Matthew walked over, placing the sticky laminated menus on the table. Close up, the wrongness of the situation magnified. The woman's silk blouse was slightly untucked. Her breathing was shallow, fast. The man smelled of expensive after and something metallic. "Coffee?" the man said before she could even look at the menu. "Black. 2. You want anything to eat?" Matthew directed the question to the woman. She opened her mouth, her eyes meeting Matthew's. There was a well of sheer, unadulterated terror in her gaze. It hit Matthew like a physical blow to the sternum. Before she could form a syllable, the man's hand shifted under the table. The woman flinched, her jaw snapping shut. "Just the coffee," the man answered for her. He smiled. It was a terrifying, dead thing that didn't reach his eyes. "My wife isn't hungry." "Right," Matthew said. He turned and walked back to the counter. The hair on the back of his neck was standing at attention. He had seen domestic disputes before. He had broken up bar fights. But this wasn't a drunken argument. The air around that table was heavy, thick with cold, calculated violence. "None of your business," a voice in his head whispered. "Pour the coffee. Take the money. Go home to your kid." Matthew grabbed 2 thick ceramic mugs. As he poured the coffee, he glanced at the reflection in the stainless steel backsplash of the coffee maker. He could see them. The man was leaning in, whispering something into the woman's ear. She was staring straight ahead at the sugar dispenser, a single tear cutting a track down her pale cheek. Matthew gripped the handle of the coffee pot until his knuckles turned white. Matthew walked back to the table carrying the 2 steaming mugs. The diner was dead silent save for the hum of the neon sign and the scratching of Lily's crayon in the back. As he approached, the woman suddenly twisted her torso, her elbow catching the edge of her empty water glass. It tipped off the table, hitting the linoleum floor with a loud, sharp crack. It didn't shatter, but it bounced, rolling under the adjacent booth. "Damn it!" the man hissed, his mask of composure slipping for a fraction of a second. He leaned over, instinctively glancing down at the floor to track the glass. It was a window of maybe 2 seconds. The woman's head snapped up. She didn't look at the floor. She looked dead into Matthew's eyes. She raised her hands, resting them flat on the sticky tabletop so the man couldn't see them from his bent position. She didn't reach for Matthew. She didn't mouth words. Her right hand formed a fist, the thumb resting across the fingers. A. She extended her index finger. G. 2 fingers. U. Fist again. Thumb tucked under the index and middle fingers. N. Matthew froze. The blood drained from his face. She saw his comprehension. Her hands moved faster now, desperate, fluid motions over the formica table. She placed her flat right hand over her left palm, bringing it toward her chest. "Help me." The man was sitting back up. The woman's hands instantly dropped to her lap, her face snapping back into a mask of hollow submission. "Leave it," the man grunted to Matthew, irritated. "Just put the coffee down." Matthew's mind was a sudden, violent storm of static. He placed the mugs on the table. His hands were shaking. He pulled back quickly, terrified the man would notice the sudden tremor in his fingers. "Need cream?" Matthew managed to ask, his voice sounding hollow, like it was coming from the end of a long tunnel. "No," the man said, dismissing him with a flick of his eyes. Matthew walked back to the counter. His boots felt like they were made of lead. He has a gun. How did a billionaire CEO, and Matthew knew she was someone important, she had that unmistakable aura of command, even in terror. No American Sign Language? It didn't matter. She had seen him signing with Lily. She had taken a massive, desperate gamble that he was fluent. Matthew slid behind the counter and grabbed a rag, blindly wiping a clean stretch of steel. He needed an excuse to look away, to hide the panic radiating off him. He looked at the back booth. Lily was holding up her coloring book, showing him the purple dog, a wide, toothy grin on her face. Matthew's heart seized. My God. Lily, if he called the cops, what would this man do? The guy was a professional. The suit, the situational awareness, the absolute calm. He wasn't a desperate junkie holding up a register. He was cold. If blue lights flashed outside those windows, he wouldn't surrender. He would take hostages. He would shoot. And the diner was an open box. There was nowhere to hide. One stray bullet cutting through the thin drywall of the booths. Matthew couldn't breathe. The instinct to protect his child screamed at him to do nothing, to let them finish their coffee, pay their bill, and walk out the door. Whoever she was, whatever trouble she was in, it wasn't worth Lily's life. Let the police find her later. He kept wiping the counter. The rag was turning gray. He glanced up at the reflection in the steel again. The woman was staring at the black coffee. Her hands were trembling now. The man was holding his coffee with his left hand. His right hand remained buried in his coat pocket, resting on his lap. He was checking his watch. They were waiting for something. A ride? A meeting? The woman slowly lifted her head. She didn't look at Matthew. She looked past the counter, straight at the back booth. She looked at Lily. Matthew saw the woman's expression break. The pure, selfish terror in her eyes melted into something else. She looked at the deaf little girl, happily oblivious to the monster 20 feet away, and a profound, devastating resignation washed over the woman's face. She looked at Matthew. She gave him a microscopic shake of her head. Don't. She was telling him not to get involved. She had seen the daughter. She understood the stakes. She was taking her plea back to save his child. Matthew stopped wiping the counter. He had spent his whole life keeping his head down, taking the hits, swallowing his pride to keep a roof over Lily's head. The world was a cruel, indifferent meat grinder, and Matthew had learned to hug the walls to avoid the blades. But looking at this woman, who was facing her own death, yet had the grace to rescind her cry for help to protect a stranger's child. Something inside Matthew snapped. It wasn't bravery. It was a deep, violently stubborn refusal to let the dark win in his diner tonight. He needed to get the cops here, but he couldn't use the phone behind the counter. The man was watching him. He couldn't hit a silent alarm. Hank was too cheap to install one. He needed a distraction. Something big enough to warrant an emergency response, but chaotic enough to mask who initiated it. Matthew's eyes drifted to the kitchen doors, to the heavy, grease-coated flat-top grill that hadn't been properly cleaned in 3 weeks. Matthew threw the rag into the sink. He stepped out from behind the counter, keeping his movements slow, lethargic, projecting the aura of a bored, minimum-wage drone. He grabbed a coffee pot and walked the floor, topping off the sleeping drunk's empty mug before approaching the center booth. He didn't look at the woman. He looked at the man. "You folks need anything else? I'm gonna head back and clean the grease traps. Might smell a bit," Matthew said, his tone flat. The man stared at him. Cold, dead eyes. He assessed Matthew, looking for a threat, looking for a tell. Matthew held his gaze, channeling every ounce of exhaustion and apathy he possessed. "Go," the man finally said, dismissing him. Matthew turned. As he walked past the back booth, he caught Lily's eye. He smiled at her. A real smile. He signed, keeping his hands low, hidden by his torso from the rest of the room. "Hide under table? Play a game? Do not come out." Lily frowned, confused, but she saw the intensity in her father's eyes. She slowly slid off the vinyl seat, ducking beneath the table, out of sight. Matthew pushed through the swinging doors into the kitchen. The kitchen was narrow, coated in a permanent layer of grime. The air was stifling. Matthew moved fast. The adrenaline he had been suppressing hit his bloodstream like a freight train. His hands shook violently as he grabbed a large metal bucket from beneath the sink. It was the grease trap overflow, filled with days of rancid, congealed fat and old frying oil. He hauled the heavy bucket over to the main flat-top grill. The grill was still on, set to a low simmer, a sheet of hot, oiled steel. He couldn't just start a fire. A small fire would just make the man grab the woman and leave. It had to be massive. It had to trigger the building's automated fire suppression system. The moment that alarm went off, it would automatically dial the fire department, and standard protocol meant police dispatch would follow immediately. Matthew looked at the swinging doors. Through the small circular windows, he could see the back of the man's head. Matthew took a breath, hoisted the heavy metal bucket, and dumped the entire contents of congealed grease directly onto the hottest section of the flat-top grill. The reaction was instantaneous. The cold grease hit the blistering steel and vaporized. A massive, thick plume of putrid gray smoke erupted toward the ceiling. It didn't ignite immediately, but it billowed out violently, filling the small kitchen in seconds. Matthew grabbed a dry kitchen towel, lit the corner of it using the pilot light of the gas stove, and tossed the flaming cloth directly into the center of the vaporizing grease pool. Whoosh! A pillar of orange flame shot upward, instantly licking the grease-stained hood vents. The heat was blinding. Matthew threw himself backward, crashing into the prep table as the fire roared to life. Thick, black, choking smoke rapidly displaced the oxygen. 10 seconds later, the ceiling sensors tripped. The diner's fire alarm didn't just ring, it shrieked. It was an ear-splitting mechanical scream accompanied by blinding, strobe-flashing white lights mounted on the walls. Chaos descended instantly. Matthew kicked the swinging kitchen doors open, bursting out into the dining room. Plumes of acrid black smoke rolled out with him, rapidly filling the ceiling of the main room. "Fire! Get out!" Matthew roared at the top of his lungs, waving his arms. The sleeping drunk bolted upright, knocking his table over, and scrambled blindly for the front door. Matthew looked at the center booth. The strobe lights cast the room in jerky, stop-motion flashes of white and dark. The man had sprung to his feet. The absolute calm was gone, replaced by the feral, high-alert posture of a cornered predator. He didn't run for the door. He grabbed the woman by the collar of her expensive coat, hauling her viciously to her feet. "Move!" the man barked, his voice barely audible over the shrieking alarm. The woman was coughing, terrified, stumbling as he dragged her toward the exit. Matthew's eyes darted to the back booth. He could see Lily's small shoes under the table. She was staying put, safe, out of the line of fire. Matthew ran toward the front of the diner, coughing, acting the part of the panicked manager trying to herd customers out. But as he intercepted the man and the woman near the foyer, he intentionally slipped on the wet linoleum near the door, crashing hard into the man's legs. It was a clumsy, desperate tackle, disguised as a fall. The man went down hard, his knee smashing into the tile. He released his grip on the woman's coat. "Run!" Matthew screamed at the woman, spitting blood where he had bitten his own tongue on impact. The woman didn't hesitate. She scrambled away, crawling toward the front door. But the man was too fast. He didn't check on his bleeding knee. He didn't try to stand up. From his kneeling position, his right hand finally came out of his coat pocket. The strobe light flashed white. In the sudden glare, the matte black steel of a suppressed semi-automatic pistol gleamed in the man's grip. He didn't aim at the fleeing woman. He leveled the barrel squarely at Matthew's chest. "You shouldn't have done that, Cook," the man whispered, racking the slide. Over the shrieking fire alarm, Matthew could hear the distant, rapidly approaching wail of sirens. But they were still miles away, and Matthew was completely out of time. The slide of the suppressed pistol snapped forward. It was a sharp, mechanical click that somehow cut through the blaring, shrieking chaos of the fire alarm. Matthew didn't brace for impact. There was no time. He just stared down the dark, hollowed-out eye of the barrel, a singular cold thought crystallizing in his mind. Lily is going to be alone. Then the ceiling exploded. The diner's fire suppression system had finally registered the massive heat spike in the kitchen. It didn't just activate the sprinklers, it triggered the industrial chemical retardant system. A violent, pressurized torrent of foul-smelling, rust-colored water and thick chemical foam blasted downward from the ceiling grates. It hit the man in the suit like a physical blow, just as his finger depressed the trigger. The gun went off. It sounded like a heavy staple gun, a dull, muffled crack. The bullet didn't hit Matthew's chest. The sudden deluge of pressurized water knocked the shooter's arm a fraction of an inch off-center. The heavy-caliber round tore through the meaty part of Matthew's left shoulder, missed the bone, and embedded itself deep into the diner's cheap linoleum floor. It didn't feel like a bullet. It felt like someone had swung a red-hot sledgehammer into his collarbone. Matthew gasped, the breath violently expelled from his lungs. He collapsed onto his back, instantly soaked in the freezing, rusted water pouring from above. The chemical foam stung his eyes, blinding him. The pain in his shoulder bloomed outward, a sickening, radiating heat that turned his left arm completely numb. He heard a heavy splash next to him. Through the stinging foam, he forced his eyes open. The woman hadn't run out the front door. She was standing over the man in the suit. Both of her hands were wrapped around the heavy, solid steel base of the diner's floor buffer, which usually sat by the coat rack. It weighed at least 30 pounds. Her face was contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. She brought the heavy steel base down directly onto the man's forearm. There was a sickening, wet crunch. The man let out a sharp, guttural hiss. The pistol clattered out of his shattered grip, spinning away across the wet tiles. The woman raised the steel base again, aiming for his skull. The man didn't panic. Even with a broken arm and the sirens now screaming right outside the diner's front windows, his survival instinct was utterly clinical. He didn't try to retrieve the gun. He rolled backward, dodging the second crushing blow, and scrambled to his feet. He shot one last, calculating look at the woman, memorizing her, memorizing the situation, before turning and sprinting for the kitchen doors. He vanished into the thick, black smoke. 2 seconds later, the front glass doors of Hank's diner blew open. "Police! Drop the weapon! Drop it!" 4 officers poured in, flashlights cutting through the chemical rain and thick smoke. They leveled their service weapons at the woman. She immediately dropped the steel floor buffer. It slammed onto the tiles. She raised her hands, coughing violently, the expensive charcoal coat completely ruined, soaked in rust and chemical foam. Matthew tried to push himself up with his right arm. The diner was spinning. The strobe lights were making him nauseous. The pain in his shoulder was rapidly evolving from a blunt ache into a sharp, tearing agony. A cop was suddenly kneeling beside him, a radio pressed to his shoulder. "Officer down! Cancel that! Civilian down! Gunshot wound! We need bus right now. Code 3. The back, Matthew croaked. He grabbed the cop's uniform shirt with a blood-slicked hand, pulling the man closer. He coughed, tasting copper. The back booth. Stay down, buddy. We got you. My daughter? Matthew roared, his voice cracking. The sudden exertion sent a shockwave of black dots across his vision. She's under the table. She can't hear you. Get her out. Another officer moved past them, tactical flashlight sweeping the booths. He reached the back table and crouched low. Matthew watched through the curtain of falling water. He saw the cop reach under the table, and a second later, a small, soaking, wet figure was pulled into the harsh light. Lily. She was clutching her ruined purple coloring book against her chest. Her eyes were wide, darting around the chaotic, terrifying scene. Matthew let his head fall back against the cold, wet floor. The black dots multiplied, swarming his vision. He focused on the steady, rhythmic pulsing of blood leaking down his back, pooling on the linoleum. He had done it. She was safe. The adrenaline finally abandoned him, leaving only the cold and the dark. Matthew closed his eyes, and the shrieking fire alarm faded into a low, distant hum. The sterile, antiseptic smell of the emergency room was a sharp contrast to the grease and smoke of the diner. Matthew sat on the edge of an examination table, his left arm immobilized in a heavy blue sling. His shoulder throbbed with a dull, persistent ache, heavily muted by whatever cocktail of painkillers the ER doc had shot into his IV an hour ago. The bullet had passed clean through. No arterial damage, no shattered bone. A miraculous, terrifying fraction of an inch between a ruined shirt and a body bag. He was wearing a faded gray hospital scrub top. His own clothes were evidence now. To his right, Lily was asleep. She was curled up in a hard plastic visitor's chair, covered by a heated hospital blanket. Her breathing was steady. Her external processors were resting on the small metal tray table next to a tray of untouched Jell-O. Matthew kept his eyes on the rise and fall of her chest. The door to the trauma bay opened. It wasn't a doctor. It was the woman from the diner. She looked entirely different, yet exactly the same. The ruined coat and soaked silk blouse were gone. In their place, she wore a simple dark cashmere sweater and fitted black trousers. Someone had brought her a change of clothes. Her hair was pulled back into a severe, immaculate knot. The terror that had vibrated off her in the diner was completely eradicated. In its place was a chilling, absolute composure. She wasn't alone. Two men stood on either side of the doorway. They wore tailored suits, but unlike the hitman, they didn't try to blend in. They were massive, their eyes scanning the hallway before stepping aside to let her in. Private security. Expensive private security. The woman walked over to the foot of Matthew's bed. She looked at him. Then she looked at the sleeping girl in the chair. Her expression softened, just a fraction, before the steel returned to her eyes. "Elodie Kensington," she said. Her voice was steady, resonant, the kind of voice used to ending arguments in boardrooms. Matthew stared at her. Matthew. Just Matthew. "The police are done with their initial statements," Elodie said, crossing her arms. "They combed the alley behind the diner. He's gone. Left a blood trail to a side street where he had a vehicle waiting. They're running traffic cams, but he's a professional. He'll be a ghost." "Good for him," Matthew muttered, leaning his head back against the wall. The painkillers made his tongue heavy. "So, you're a Kensington, like the telecom Kensingtons, the ones who buy out city grids." "I am the CEO of Kensington Global, yes," she said, devoid of ego. It was merely a statement of fact. "Makes sense. Normal people don't have John Wick breathing down their necks over a cup of decaf." Matthew gestured weakly with his good arm toward the door. "So, you got your army. You survived. I'm guessing you're here to offer me a generous check for ruining my minimum wage career." Elodie didn't flinch at his tone. She pulled a chair closer to the bed and sat down. She kept her back straight. "I am alive because you threw a bucket of grease on a grill and took a bullet for me," she said, her voice dropping a register, losing some of its boardroom polish. "I signaled you. I pulled you into my nightmare. And when I realized you had a child, I told you to back off. You didn't." "He was going to kill you," Matthew said simply. "I don't like blood on my floors. Hard to mop up." A ghost of a smile touched Elodie's lips, vanishing instantly. "The man who brought me to your diner was my head of corporate security. He's been with my family for 10 years. Tonight, he intercepted my car, disabled my driver, and told me we were going for a ride. He needed me to authorize a massive, irrevocable transfer of company assets from my personal biometric terminal. The diner was a pit stop. He thought it was empty. He thought I was subdued." Matthew looked at the two large men guarding the door. "And these guys? Contractors, flown in an hour ago, loyal to my money, not my board of directors." She leaned forward. "Someone very powerful and very close to me wants me dead, and they failed tonight because of a fry cook with a death wish." "I don't have a death wish," Matthew snapped, the cynicism flaring up. "I have a kid. I have rent. I did what I had to do so that guy didn't turn my diner into a slaughterhouse. We're even. You can keep your check. I just want to go home, put my kid in her own bed, and figure out how the hell I'm going to pay for groceries with one arm." Elodie stared at him. The silence stretched between them, heavy and suffocating. "You can't go home, Matthew," she said quietly. Matthew frowned, trying to sit up straighter, wincing as his shoulder screamed in protest. "Excuse me? You're not thinking clearly. The painkillers are masking the reality of your situation," Elodie stated, her tone entirely pragmatic. "My former head of security is currently icing a shattered arm. He is a meticulous, ruthless man. He knows my face. He knows my resources. But more importantly, he knows yours." She pointed a perfectly manicured finger at Matthew. "He saw your face. He knows where you work. He knows you have a deaf daughter. You are a loose end. And the people who hired him do not leave loose ends. If you go back to your apartment tonight, you will not wake up tomorrow." The cold reality of her words crashed over Matthew, washing away the narcotic haze. He looked at Lily. She looked so small under the blanket. The panic that had subsided in the diner suddenly clawed its way back up his throat. "I'll call the cops," Matthew said. "They can post a black and white outside my building." "The police are a deterrent for street thugs, not for a billion-dollar corporate hit squad," Elodie replied. She stood up. "Hank's diner is a crime scene. It will likely be condemned due to fire damage. You have no job. You have no security. You have a target on your back because you chose to save my life." She reached into her pocket and pulled out a heavy matte black keycard, tossing it onto Matthew's lap. "I own a fortified residential complex in the financial district. It requires biometric clearance, private elevators, and it's currently swarming with the most expensive tactical contractors on the eastern seaboard. You and Lily are coming with me." Matthew stared at the keycard. It felt like a trap. A velvet cage. He was a guy who counted pennies to buy alkaline batteries for his daughter's ears, and now he was being swept up in a war between billionaires. "I don't belong in your world," Matthew said, his voice rough. "You belong to it now," Elodie said softly. "You bought your ticket when you threw that grease. Now, are you going to let pride kill your daughter, or are you going to put on a shirt and come with me?" Matthew looked at the keycard. Then he looked at Lily. He grabbed the card with his good hand. The armored SUV smelled of rich leather and ozone. It was a tank dressed in luxury, heavily plated and entirely soundproof. The tinted windows turned the early morning city into a passing blur of muted gray and washed-out streetlights. Matthew sat in the back. Lily buckled in beside him. She was wide awake now, her external processors reattached. She was looking around the massive cabin of the vehicle, running her small hands over the plush leather seats with blatant, unfiltered awe. Elodie sat in the front passenger seat, constantly tapping away on a glowing tablet, speaking in low, clipped tones to the driver, one of her private security men. Matthew felt like a hostage all over again. "Where exactly are we going?" Matthew asked, breaking the heavy silence. Elodie didn't look up from her tablet. "The Apex building. It's a commercial property I own, but the top 3 floors are converted into a private residence. It has an independent power grid, direct satellite uplinks, and a reinforced core. It's safe." "Sounds like a bunker." "A bunker with a very good view," she replied. Matthew looked down at Lily. She tugged at his good sleeve. "Rich lady?" Lily signed, her movements small, keeping them close to her chest. Matthew nodded slowly. "Yes. Very rich." "Why are we in her car?" Matthew hesitated. "How do you explain corporate assassination to a 7-year-old? "Our house is broken. We are staying with her, just for a little bit." Lily seemed to accept this, returning her attention to the small, refrigerated compartment built into the center console, which she had discovered was full of expensive, sparkling water. The SUV descended into a subterranean parking garage beneath a massive, glittering glass skyscraper. The concrete walls were lined with surveillance cameras. 2 massive steel doors rolled open as they approached, sealing shut behind them the moment the vehicle cleared the threshold. "We take the private elevator," Elodie said, finally putting the tablet away as the SUV parked. "Direct access to the penthouse." They stepped out into the pristine, climate-controlled garage. Matthew felt wildly out of place. He was wearing the hospital scrubs, a cheap pair of sweatpants a nurse had scrounged up for him, and his scuffed, grease-stained work boots. They boarded the elevator. There were no buttons. Elodie pressed her thumb against a biometric scanner, and the car shot upward with terrifying, silent speed. When the doors opened, Matthew actually held his breath. The penthouse didn't look like a home. It looked like an art gallery suspended in the clouds. Floor-to-ceiling windows wrapped around the entire space, offering a staggering 360-degree view of the waking city. The floors were polished dark wood. The furniture was minimalist, sharp, and undoubtedly cost more than Matthew had made in a decade. But beneath the extreme luxury, Matthew's cynical eye caught the details. The glass in the windows had a faint, iridescent sheen. Bulletproof. The front door they hadn't used looked to be solid steel wrapped in wood veneer. And standing in the corners of the massive living room were 2 more men in suits, earpieces glowing faintly in the dim morning light. "Show them to the guest wing, Thomas," Elodie told one of the men. She finally turned to Matthew. The exhaustion was beginning to show on her face, cracking the porcelain mask. "Get some sleep, Matthew. The kitchen is fully stocked. A doctor will be by tomorrow to check on your shoulder." "And then what?" Matthew asked, refusing to move. "We just sit in this glass box until your board of directors decides to stop playing hitman?" Elodie stopped. She turned back to him, her eyes flashing with a sudden, sharp intensity. "I am not hiding," Elodie said, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "I am regrouping. The men who tried to kill me tonight made a miscalculation. They assumed I was weak. They assumed I would break." She walked slowly toward Matthew, closing the distance until she was standing just a few feet away. "They used my own security against me. They violated my life. I'm going to find out exactly who signed that order, and I am going to utterly dismantle them. I am going to take everything they have, ruin their legacies, and bury them in the wreckage of their own ambition." She stared into Matthew's eyes, and for a moment he didn't see the polished CEO. He saw a predator. "You and your daughter are here because I owe you a debt," Elodie continued, her tone softening slightly, though the danger remained. "I protect my investments. And right now, keeping you alive is my priority. Sleep, Matthew. Tomorrow we start the war." She turned and walked down a long, dimly lit hallway, her heels clicking rhythmically against the hardwood floor until she disappeared. Thomas, the large security guard, gestured toward the opposite side of the penthouse. "Right this way, sir." Matthew let out a long, slow breath. His shoulder throbbed in time with his heartbeat. He looked down at Lily. She was staring out the massive windows at the city sprawling far below, completely captivated by the thousands of tiny, twinkling lights. He was out of the diner. He was out of the grease and the grime. But as he looked at the thick, bulletproof glass separating them from the world outside, Matthew realized the terrifying truth. He hadn't escaped the danger. He had just moved into the center of the blast radius. He placed his good hand gently on Lily's head, guiding her away from the windows and toward the guest wing. He had to stay sharp. He had to heal. Because Elodie Kensington was about to start a war, and Matthew knew better than anyone that in a war of billionaires, it was always the poor who ended up as collateral damage. Waking up in a $50,000 bed did not make a bullet wound hurt any less. Matthew opened his eyes. A vast, unbroken expanse of pristine white ceiling stared back at him. For 3 seconds, his brain fed him the comforting lie that he was at home. Then he tried to roll over. A hot wire of agony snapped across his left collarbone, stealing the breath right out of his lungs. He gritted his teeth. Right. The diner. The hitman. The billionaire. He pushed himself upright using his good right arm. The heavy blue sling dragged uncomfortably against his neck. The hospital-issue sweatpants bagged at his knees. "Lily," he rasped. The guest room was empty. Panic, cold and sharp, spiked in his chest. He stood up too fast, waiting a second for the room to stop tilting, and stumbled through the heavy oak door. He found her in the kitchen. It was less a kitchen and more a culinary theater of brushed steel and imported marble. Lily sat on a high chrome stool, wearing a massive, oversized white t-shirt that belonged to someone much larger. Her external processors were clipped neatly behind her ears. She was intensely focused on eating a thick, golden Belgian waffle piled high with fresh berries. Across the island stood Thomas, the massive private security contractor. He had shed his suit jacket. A heavy Glock 19 sat snug in his leather shoulder holster. He was awkwardly pouring organic maple syrup from a glass carafe onto Lily's plate. Matthew leaned against the doorframe, letting out a long, ragged exhale. Lily spotted him. She dropped her fork, her syrup-sticky fingers flying as she signed. "Dad, good sleep?" "Waffle is good. Man makes good waffle." Matthew managed a weak, crooked smile. He tapped his chest, then pointed at her. "Glad you're eating. Be polite." Thomas looked over, his face an unreadable slab of muscle. "Ms. Kensington is in the study. She requested you join her when you were able, sir." "Right," Matthew muttered. He walked over, pressing a kiss to the top of Lily's messy curls. She smelled like expensive shampoo and strawberries. "Stay here. Finish your food." Matthew navigated the sprawling penthouse. The morning sun blazed through the bulletproof windows, painting the hardwood floors in harsh geometric shapes. He found the study at the end of the hall. The door was ajar. Elodie Kensington stood in front of a massive, glowing smartboard that dominated the far wall. She wore the exact same clothes as the night before. A half-empty pot of black coffee sat on the mahogany desk, right next to a sleek, suppressed tactical rifle. The screen was a chaotic web of financial diagrams, corporate hierarchies, and flashing numbers. "You find out who ordered the hit?" Matthew asked, slumping heavily into a leather chair. "I don't have to find out. I know who it is," Elodie said. She tapped a stylus against the glass, bringing up a photograph of a silver-haired man in his late 60s. He wore a tailored suit and a smile that looked practiced in a mirror. "Arthur Croft, chairman of my board. My father's oldest friend. Let me guess. He thinks you're bad for the quarterly earnings. Elodie finally turned. Her eyes were bloodshot, the skin beneath them bruised with exhaustion. Kensington Global routes internet traffic for half the eastern seaboard. 2 weeks ago, I found a backdoor built into our proprietary hardware. Someone was skimming raw intelligence, selling it to a third-party buyer. Arthur left the door open. And you caught him. I froze his division's assets yesterday afternoon, Elodie said, crossing her arms. I assumed he would call his lawyers. I assumed he would try to bury me in injunctions. Instead, he bought Jonathan Hayes, the guy with the broken arm. My former head of security, Elodie corrected. Arthur paid him to intercept me, force a biometric transfer of my shares under duress, and stage my suicide. But you threw a bucket of grease on his plan. Matthew rubbed his unshaven jaw. So call the FBI. You have the data. Arthur is wiping the servers as we speak, Elodie countered coldly. By noon today, every trace of his treason will be gone. He controls my own security apparatus. If I go to the authorities now, he will frame me for the data leak. I will spend the rest of my life in a federal prison while he liquidates my empire. Matthew stared at the web of billions of dollars on the screen. He let out a harsh, bitter laugh. Elodie narrowed her eyes. You find this amusing? I find it exhausting, Matthew said. You're looking at this like a billionaire. You're tracking data, shares, grand strategy. You're trying to outmaneuver him in the boardroom. Matthew stood up, walking toward the glowing board. The war isn't in the data, Matthew said, tapping a smudged finger against the pristine screen. The war is right here. Hayes has a pulverized forearm. I hit him with a 30-pound piece of solid steel. You think Arthur Croft is wiping servers? He's sitting in a mansion sipping scotch, waiting for his attack dog to finish the job. Elodie frowned. Hayes is a ghost. He went to ground. Bleeding men aren't ghosts, Matthew shot back. He can't go to a hospital. A gunshot wound and a crushed arm gets flagged instantly. Where does a millionaire's hitman go at 4 a.m. to get his bones set? An underground clinic. A concierge doctor who doesn't ask questions and only takes cash. Matthew pointed at the screen. Stop looking for the $4 billion. Look for the 50 grand. Look for the petty cash Arthur pulled out of a discretionary fund in the last 12 hours. Elodie stared at him. The tactical, ruthless CEO was suddenly confronted by the grim, street-level logic of a man who had spent his life surviving in the margins. She spun back to the console on her desk. Her fingers flew across the keyboard. Code and financial ledgers blurred across the massive screen. Matthew watched her, the raw force of her intellect stripping away the firewalls of her own company. Got it, she whispered 10 minutes later. A shell company in the Cayman Islands. A withdrawal of $200,000 in bearer bonds. Authorized at midnight. Flagged for courier delivery. Where? Matthew asked. Elodie hit her key. An address populated on the screen. An industrial park in Queens. A private medical facility. Strictly off the books. She looked at Matthew, a sharp glint of respect in her eyes. You're right. He's a patient. She picked up a secure radio from the desk. Thomas, prep the strike team. We have a location on Hayes. Wait, Matthew said. The hair on his arms suddenly stood on end. The same cold instinct that had warned him in the diner gripped his throat. Arthur authorized the cash at midnight? Yes. Before the diner. Before Hayes failed, Matthew said, his heart rate accelerating. He didn't authorize that money to pay a doctor for a broken arm. He authorized it to pay Hayes for the hit. Elodie froze. If Hayes failed, Matthew whispered, why would Arthur still send the money? The radio in Elodie's hand crackled with static. But it wasn't Thomas's voice that came through. It was a flat, gravelly voice. He didn't send the money, Elodie, Hayes said over the radio. I just took it from your security chief's corpse. The lights in the penthouse abruptly cut out. The sudden, absolute darkness was suffocating. The hum of the climate control, the faint whir of the massive server racks. Everything died in an instant. The only light came from the panoramic windows, a dim, gray morning light struggling through heavy rain clouds. Matthew didn't freeze. The adrenaline hit him, a familiar, toxic rush that violently pushed the pain in his shoulder to the background. "Lily!" he roared, lunging toward the study door. Elodie grabbed his good arm, stopping him. In the dim light, her face was a mask of pure, calculated ice. "Stop! He wants you to run out there. It's a fatal funnel." "My daughter is in the kitchen," Matthew snarled, ripping his arm away. "Thomas is with her," Elodie said, grabbing the tactical rifle from the desk. She racked the bolt in the dark. "If Hayes is on the comms, he bypassed the building's main frame. The elevators are dead. The stairwell doors are magnetically sealed. We are locked in." "He trapped us?" "No," Elodie said, moving towards the door, her eyes scanning the dark hallway. "He trapped himself in here with us. He knows his career is over. He knows I'm coming for Arthur. This is a scorched earth play. He's going to finish the job or he's going to die trying." A heavy, suppressed thwip echoed from the far end of the penthouse, followed by the sickening thud of a heavy body hitting the hardwood floor. Matthew's blood ran cold. Thomas. He didn't wait for Elodie. He dropped to his knees, ignoring the agonizing flare in his shoulder, and crawled into the hallway. The kitchen was 50 feet away, a cavernous, shadowed space. "Lily," Matthew hissed, keeping his voice barely above a whisper. He crept forward, pressing his back against the wall. He could see the kitchen island. Thomas was on the floor, a dark pool spreading rapidly beneath him. He wasn't moving. But there was no sign of Lily. Matthew's breath hitched. His eyes darted around the dim kitchen, the pantry, the massive sub-zero refrigerators. Where would she go? Hide under table? Play a game? Do not come out. That was what he had told her in the diner. Matthew shifted his angle, peering under the heavy marble overhang of the kitchen island. Deep in the shadows, tucked behind a row of bar stools, he saw a sliver of white cotton. Her oversized shirt. She was curled into a tiny ball, her hands clamped over her eyes. She hadn't heard the gunshot. She hadn't heard Thomas fall. But she had felt the vibration. She had known the rules had changed. Matthew slowly exhaled. He had to get to her. Footsteps. Heavy, measured, and entirely silent. Matthew froze. A silhouette materialized at the far edge of the living room. It was Hayes. He was moving with the slow, terrifying grace of a predator that knows it has cornered its prey. His left arm was in a heavy, crude black splint, strapped tightly to his chest. His right hand held a suppressed submachine gun. He was wearing night vision goggles. He owned the dark. Hayes was sweeping the room, his head panning left to right. He was looking for heat signatures. He was looking for Elodie. Matthew was pinned behind the kitchen wall. If he moved toward Lily, Hayes would see him. If he stayed put, Hayes would eventually sweep the kitchen and find her. Matthew looked around frantically. He was unarmed. He had one good arm. He was a fry cook up against a Tier 1 operator. Think like a cook. Use the kitchen. Matthew reached up with his right hand, his fingers blindly tracing the wall. He felt the sleek, flush panel of the smart home interface. Dead. No power. He looked down at Thomas's body. The Glock 19 was still in its holster. But getting to it meant stepping out into the open. Wait. The stove. Elodie's kitchen didn't have a standard electric range. It had a massive 6-burner industrial gas range. Even if the digital igniters were dead, the gas lines were mechanical. They ran on physical pressure valves. Matthew slowly, painfully dragged himself along the baseboards until he reached the oven. He reached up, his fingers gripping the heavy metal knobs. He didn't turn them to ignite. He just turned them open. Hiss. The sound of raw, natural gas flooding out of the 6 massive burners was faint, but in the dead silence of the penthouse, it seemed deafening. Hayes stopped sweeping the living room. His head snapped toward the kitchen. The night vision goggles couldn't see gas, but the acoustics of the room gave Matthew away. Hayes raised the submachine gun, leveling it at the kitchen counter. He advanced, his boots making 0 sound on the wood. Matthew needed a spark. He patted his sweatpants. Nothing. He looked frantically around the floor. Thomas's body. Matthew crawled a few agonizing feet, reaching out and patting down the dead security guard's pockets. Nothing. The smell of gas was getting thick. It was pooling near the ceiling, heavy and noxious. Hayes was 10 feet away. He was going to round the corner in 3 seconds. Matthew looked at the kitchen island. Lily was still hiding underneath. But next to her, on the floor, was the carafe of organic maple syrup Thomas had dropped. It had shattered. And next to the sticky puddle of syrup was the metal toaster. It was plugged into the wall. The power was out. But the penthouse had to have an emergency backup generator. A place like this wouldn't just go dark. There was a delay. A mechanical transfer switch. 10 seconds. 15 seconds. Matthew grabbed the heavy metal toaster by its cord. He yanked it hard, pulling it off the counter. It hit the floor with a loud crash. Hayes rounded the corner instantly, the submachine gun raised. The green lenses of his goggles locked onto Matthew kneeling on the floor. Hayes didn't say a word. He just smiled, a cold, dead smirk, and squeezed the trigger. Thwip, thwip, thwip. Wood splinters exploded next to Matthew's face. He threw himself flat, screaming as his left shoulder slammed into the tiles. Before Hayes could adjust his aim to finish him, the penthouse emergency backup generators roared to life deep in the building's core. The power slammed back on. The massive floor-to-ceiling LED lighting in the kitchen flared to life at 100% brightness. The sudden, violent burst of light hit Hayes's night vision goggles like a physical punch. The light-amplifying lenses flared brilliant, blinding white. Hayes let out a scream, ripping the goggles off his face, completely blind. "Now!" Matthew roared, kicking the toaster directly into the center of the kitchen, right beneath the gas-flooded stove. He didn't wait. He lunged under the island, grabbing Lily with his good arm, and shielded her body with his own. Elodie Kensington stepped out from the hallway. She didn't hesitate. She didn't aim for Hayes. She leveled the tactical rifle at the heavy metal toaster resting in the expanding cloud of natural gas. She pulled the trigger. The spark from the bullet striking the steel toaster ignited the gas cloud. The explosion wasn't a Hollywood fireball. It was a concussive, violent shockwave of blue flame that detonated with a deafening thoom. It blew the heavy range hood off its hinges and shattered every piece of glassware in the kitchen. The force of the blast picked Hayes up and threw him violently backward through the air. He crashed through the heavy glass coffee table in the living room, a tangle of broken limbs and shattered glass. Matthew felt the heat wash over him, singing the hair on his arms. He held on to Lily, burying her face against his chest, refusing to let go until the ringing in his ears faded. The fire suppression system in the kitchen activated, raining clean, cold water down on the burning cabinetry. Matthew slowly opened his eyes. He looked out from under the island. Hayes wasn't moving. He lay in the ruins of the living room, bleeding out onto the polished hardwood. Elodie lowered the rifle. She stood in the falling water, staring at the man who had protected her for 10 years, and the man who had just tried to end her life. Her face was entirely blank. Matthew let out a ragged breath. He looked down at Lily. She was staring up at him, her eyes wide, her small hands gripping his hospital shirt tight enough to turn her knuckles white. "Safe?" she signed, her hands trembling. Matthew closed his eyes, resting his forehead against hers. "Safe," he signed back. We are safe. The aftermath of violence among the wealthy is remarkably quiet. There were no screaming sirens. There were no flashing blue lights. Within 20 minutes, Elodie's secondary security team had arrived. They were silent, efficient men who moved like shadows. They bagged the bodies. They swept the glass. They scrubbed the blood from the hardwood floors with industrial chemicals that smelled faintly of lemon. Matthew sat on a plush velvet sofa in the far corner of the living room. Paramedics, private ones naturally, had redressed his shoulder wound and pumped him full of high-grade, non-drowsy painkillers. Lily was asleep again, her head resting on his good leg. The sheer trauma and adrenaline of the night had completely exhausted her. Matthew stroked her hair, staring blankly at the massive hole in the ceiling where the kitchen range hood used to be. Elodie walked into the room. She had changed clothes again, a sharp, tailored gray suit, the armor of the boardroom. She held a thick manila folder in her hands. She stood across the ruined coffee table, looking down at Matthew. Arthur Croft was arrested by federal agents 10 minutes ago at his estate in the Hamptons, Elodie said. Her voice was steady, but the exhaustion had settled deep into her bones. I sent the unredacted ledgers directly to the SEC and the FBI. He won't see the outside of a cell for the rest of his life. The board is calling an emergency session. I will own the company outright by tomorrow morning. Congratulations, Matthew said, his voice flat. You won the war. We won, Elodie corrected him. She dropped the manila folder onto the cushion next to him. Matthew looked at it. He didn't touch it. What's this? A non-disclosure agreement? Blood money? It's a deed, Elodie said simply. Matthew frowned. A deed to what? Hank's diner, Elodie replied. She crossed her arms, leaning against the window glass. The building was severely damaged by the fire suppression system you triggered. Hank couldn't afford the repairs. He was going to declare bankruptcy and sell the lot to a developer. I bought the property from him an hour ago, and I just transferred the title, free and clear, to a blind trust in your name. Matthew stared at her, stunned. The cynical armor he wore like a second skin cracked. I don't know how to run a restaurant. You know how to survive, Elodie countered. You know how to protect people, and you know how to make a decent cup of coffee. The trust also includes a massive capital injection, enough to completely renovate the building, hire a full staff, and keep you afloat for 5 years, even if you never sell a single hamburger. Matthew looked down at the folder. A diner. His own diner. No more graveyard shifts, no more answering to a boss who didn't care. It was the American dream, handed to him in a manila folder by a billionaire who owed him her life. And there is one more thing, Elodie said, her voice softening. The icy CEO vanished, replaced by the terrified woman who had sat in the booth just 24 hours ago. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, sleek black box. She placed it gently on the table. Kensington Global doesn't just do data, Elodie said quietly. We hold patents in advanced biotechnology, specifically neural acoustic interfaces. Matthew's breath caught in his throat. He looked from the box to Lily's sleeping face. Those are prototypes, Elodie said, gesturing to the box. Next-generation cochlear implants. They don't require external batteries. They interface directly with the auditory nerve. They are waterproof, shockproof, and they will give her a spectrum of sound she has never experienced. My chief medical officer will perform the surgery next week, all expenses paid for the rest of her life. Tears, hot and unbidden, pricked at the corners of Matthew's eyes. He didn't wipe them away. The physical pain of his shoulder, the sheer terror of the gun barrel, the exhaustion of fighting for every single inch of ground in his life. It all suddenly broke over him like a wave. He had thrown a bucket of grease on a grill to save a stranger. He had expected to die for it. Instead, he had saved his daughter's life. Matthew looked up at Elodie Kensington. He didn't see a billionaire. He didn't see a CEO. He saw a woman who understood that true power wasn't about destroying your enemies. It was about paying your debts. "Thank you," Matthew whispered, his voice cracking. It was the most honest thing he had said in 10 years. Elodie offered a small, genuine smile. It reached her eyes. "You're welcome, Matthew. Now take your daughter and go home." The sun was fully up by the time the armored SUV dropped Matthew and Lily off at their small, cramped apartment building in Queens. The air smelled of wet asphalt and impending rain. Matthew carried Lily up the 3 flights of stairs with his good arm. He unlocked the flimsy wooden door, stepping into the familiar, cramped space. It was messy. It was small. But it was entirely theirs. He laid Lily down on her bed, pulling the faded superhero blanket up to her chin. She stirred, her eyes fluttering open. She looked at her room, then up at her father. "Home?" She signed, a sleepy smile spreading across her face. Matthew sat on the edge of the bed. He reached out, his calloused thumb gently brushing a stray curl from her forehead. He thought about the men in the suits. He thought about the blood on the diner floor. And he thought about the deed sitting in his jacket pocket. The world was still a cruel, indifferent meat grinder. But today, they had beaten the blades. "Yes," Matthew signed back, his hand steady, his heart finally, truly at peace. "We are home." Matthew thought he was just surviving another grueling graveyard shift. But his split-second decision to risk everything for a terrified stranger changed his and Lily's lives forever. This story proves that true power doesn't always come from corporate empires or billions of dollars. Sometimes it comes from a father's stubborn refusal to look the other way in the dark. If Matthew's grit and Elodie's ultimate payback kept you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button and share this video with someone who needs a reminder that bravery still exists in the shadows. Make sure to subscribe to the channel right now for more intense, grounded stories that hit straight at the heart.